If I'm being entirely honest, I kind of forgot about Starfield. I played a good chunk of hours, don't get me wrong, and I enjoyed a decent chunk of those hours, but I was under no illusions that this wasn't a flawed game. The incessant reliance on procedural generation was infuriating. The bulk of the good content out there to be found was too well hidden under the repetitive rubbish. Outside of combat, spaceflight being anything other than fast travel in disguise is an illusion. And if humans spend a third of their lives asleep, Bethesda is hell-bent on ensuring you spend a further third staring at a loading screen. But I never hated Starfield. I always felt, every so often, you'd find something genuinely interesting playing it. But, naturally, when I'd sapped it of everything it had to offer, I simply switched the game off and hadn't played it since. And to say that frankly I find Starfield's replay value is lacking considering it's a Bethesda Game Studios RPG is about as scathing a criticism as I could come up with. But I did want to return to it around the time of the release of the Shattered Space DLC that dropped on the 30th of September, to not only see if it does anything worthy of returning to this game in the first place, but also to observe if any of the criticisms I had for the base game have been addressed. And while I didn't go in expecting miracles, as it's still Starfield, the criticisms I had were far from unique to myself. You see, Starfield has two major issues. First being how Bethesda Game Studios structure their games is incredibly outdated. I'm not a purist of seamlessness or anything like that, but loading screens between interiors and exteriors, for instance, is rather ye olde. And the other issue is the concept of Starfield itself, this space exploration game. So massive in scope that it has to rely on swathes of procedural generation that doesn't really produce anything meaningful. You can visit as many of the 1,000 planets as you like, but it's very rare that you'll find something actually interesting, something worth your time. Substituting the rich atmospheric worlds of the Elder Scrolls and Fallout for mile after mile of barren landscapes filled with mind-numbing activities, giving something that feels like a much smaller game the appearance of a gargantuan experience when in reality it's anything but. And at the very least, that can be acknowledged in a DLC that focuses on one planet. Hang on a moment.
Child, you will be silent.
There's no world in which that would fix the rest of the game, but will Bethesda fare better when the gimmick that tanks Starfield's overall quality is no longer relevant? That is the proposed question that Shattered Space sets out to answer. And if you're looking for the short and easy answer, no. This expansion proved to be nothing spectacular. The open world space, though there's only one pertinent to the DLC, wiping out the need to take off and go to a different planet every 5 seconds, is apparently handcrafted and boasts more stuff going on. But it's got about as much depth as the world of Assassin's Creed Odyssey, which believe me isn't a compliment, and I could now quite happily go the rest of my life never seeing a magenta hue again. Many locations are still generically named and don't do an awful lot to stand out. There are some visual distinctions here and there as well as unique locations, which is nice, but they're still sporadic and fade into being a backdrop for fetch quests. The world map looks like this. For God's sake, Bethesda, put some nice fog in there, please. And of course, if you do fancy it, there's an entirely new star system. So you can explore other planets in the system, just in case you've not played enough Starfield to realise there's probably nothing there. There's no real major mechanical introductions to the gameplay, which is a missed opportunity, but the gameplay isn't necessarily bad, it's just Starfield, but more. And the plot is okay if you don't mind listening to it being delivered through monotonous lines of dialogue that often comes complete with a forced, vaguely Slavic accent. And then every once in a while there'll just be some American guy. That last bit isn't an actual criticism, by the way. I'm not going to make a thing of it, a lot of games fumble at that hurdle, but it's still funny. So as you can tell, I didn't come away from Shattered Space feeling awfully fond. I didn't hate playing it, because I don't hate playing Starfield as it turns out. But it has done little to nothing to address the game's issues that stem from Bethesda's pursuit of this massive game that Starfield is pretending to be. So let's look at this bit by bit. Starfield Shattered Space is the House Varun DLC that Bethesda has been promising since before Starfield released, I think. I don't know. When was it announced? Who cares? It's not important anymore. What is important is House Varun is the most mysterious post-Earth human civilization. They're also a touch religiously zealous. In short, they believe in a god known as the Great Serpent, a giant space snake that will apparently come and devour the universe. And most House Varun encounters we have in the base game are fanatics, zealots, a splinter group that doesn't largely represent House Varun's core. Beyond that, House Varun are quite an insular people. They have limited contact with the settled systems, to the point where even the location of their homeworld, Varun Kai, is a protected secret, and as such they aren't particularly fond of outsiders showing up on their proverbial doorstep. And now a mystery in which their people are turning translucent has drawn us to their homeworld. We find ourselves in their capital city, Dazra, that has conveniently largely been decimated by some space-time malarkey, significant to the aforementioned mystery. Dredging up one major problem with Bethesda RPGs, their cities are the size of what would qualify as a small village in real life. And while there's a serviceable plot reason for that, I'm doubtful Bethesda could craft a convincingly sized inhabited area if they wanted to. This isn't a critique of the playable area feeling small and bland. That is a critique I'm going to make, but it's not relevant to this. Nor am I saying this as a point against Bethesda's delivery of scale, though I do think that's an issue that needs addressing too. Nor am I expecting Bethesda to accomplish impossible things, but the very concept of Starfield does a terrific job at exposing this problem. Take Jemison in the base game for instance, the heart of the United Colonies, effectively the centre of the settled systems. You can enter it one way and within 2 minutes be out the other. It's a pathetically tiny city for what is effectively the capital of a huge chunk of the galaxy. And then the rest of the world, aside from some procedurally generated locations, including random huts that are placed that are technically settlements in their own right, is completely devoid of anything even close to New Atlantis. If this is the primary settled world, why is there only one city on it? And why is the rest of the planet almost entirely devoid of any organised settlements? Of course, it's impossible for them to create a copium of convincing planets, so what is the point in this land anywhere gimmick? As it just makes it harder to believe that there are things canonically there that we can't visit. Dazra on the moon of Varun Kai in this DLC has the exact same problem. It's a glorified village slapped on an empty world. You can headcanon there are other cities on the surface of this world, but if you had enough time and self-loathing, you could more or less canvas the entire surface and find out that there isn't. Albeit you'll do a lot of taking off and landing next to yourself in the process because the game's planets are effectively multiple cells strung together, and I think they only really generate when you land there unless there's a specific point where it wants you to land. And so Shattered Space attempts to convince us that this glorified village on an otherwise desolate planet is the political heart of a civilization. And there, Bethesda's approach to scaling the game is clashing with the very concept of Starfield even here in the expansion. Because I can believe Jemison to canonically be more than a city block, but when that's all there is to see, it is hard to ignore. Suspense of disbelief does wobble. You're probably wondering why this isn't an issue that gets in my way of enjoying Skyrim, and that's a fair question. And I'd argue it is an issue with Bethesda games across the board, and Skyrim cities are another perfect example. But that entire world is handcrafted, it's curated. If you're exploring it, it's always possible to look at something else. Scaling is consistent and that allows you to continue to immerse yourself. When exploring this world, the tiny city at the heart of it is all there really is to look at. And you can explore the rest of the world in its entirety to your heart's content and find a grand total of absolutely nothing worthwhile. In an attempt to make everything more, Starfield and even the Shattered Space expansion wind up being less. And the point I'm trying to make is the technical accomplishment that Starfield is trying to be actively undermines it more often than not. And that is unfortunately a fundamental flaw with how Starfield is delivered that impacts everything including this DLC. The question of course is, could Bethesda have done something to mitigate this problem? Well, frankly, I think they did try. At least a portion of the space surrounding Dazra is worthy of exploring. Worthwhile activities or otherwise, it's not all instantly procedurally generated tripe. The DLC also bids to give you a reason to stick around on the surface of the planet for longer than 5 minutes. It's a moon, I keep tripping up on that, I do apologise, it's semantics. Once you've touched down on Varun Kai, that's where the entirety of the DLC's main story takes place, which does suggest the expansion is pushing against at least the star portion of Starfield. It's just a bloody shame all we get instead is field. And don't get me wrong, I can understand why they've gone this way. Starfield was heavily criticised for its space travel in particular. Outside of combat, flying your ship is a series of skyboxes, obstacles and occasional encounters. And if you wanted to actually move anywhere, the process of doing so was the equivalent to fast travel complete with a loading screen. And so, this massively superficial element to the game, as vibey as it is chilling on a fucking spaceship, artificially accelerated the game's pacing in the sense that you never stick around on one planet for terribly long. And so yes, I do believe there were intentions with this expansion to ground us in a deliberate environment for a more prolonged period. And that was, as a very idea, refreshing. However, what matters is how that's handled. There may be more locations in this region, making it much denser than, say, if you chose to land at a random spot on the dark side of the moon, but I can't say that it necessarily stood out aside from a rather abrasive magenta fog that appears to follow you everywhere. And so this world space, even with more locations and some unique locations, still feels rather bland. Outside of the pitifully small settlement that is Dazra, it's painfully underpopulated, unless we're talking about these monstrosities plucked straight from a H.P. Lovecraft wet dream. And a lot of the locations still fall under the umbrella of being generic. What's the point in deliberately crafting this world space, forcing us to stay in it, and then barely doing much of anything to make that experience worthwhile? And this issue expands into the quests that there are. The main quest is fine if you can stomach some rather stiff dialogue, and I would say it borders on being genuinely interesting if you pardon the delivery mechanisms, but it's in the side content where a game justifies its open world status, and sadly overall the side quests in Shattered Space could have probably been better. Fetch quests collecting samples for a married couple who happen to be colleagues researching something that I don't care about, because all I do is collect the samples. Running between shrines just to read a vague bit of lore because a man who looks a bit like Santa Claus if somebody gave him meth claims it's the path to redemption. Delivering stuff, all bloke to form a good bulk of the side content there actually is. And since that's dire, the genuinely good stuff is rare. The most memorable side quest in the game for me is aiding an elderly gentleman in coming to terms with the loss of his granddaughter in the disaster that brought Dazra down to Bethesda size. He's a scatterbrained bloke who can't find his things and his house is a mess, so we help him clean up and find some of his things along the way. And what makes it memorable is the activity is rather unique. You're simply picking up rubbish and sticking it in a bin, and that doesn't sound particularly glorious, and that's the point, it's not. But in cleaning up the place, we're concurrently jogging the man's memory. He talks us through his existence as we go along, and that combined with all the information we find around the apartment paints a welcome, convincing picture of the man's life. We're not unravelling some fascinating mystery or taking part in an action-packed gunfight or space battle, but this quest rather uniquely has a consistent impact. And that, combined with the game's pivoting of mechanics to suit the moment, renders what should be a rather average side quest quite memorable. There are other side quests that arguably aren't shit, but there aren't many side quests in total, so the point I'm trying to make, and this is why I'm being quite harsh here, why bother with the wank ones when the ability to make the half-decent ones is obviously there? Not only does it baffle me that there are so few side quests and yet some of them still feel like filler, but also why risk the player's patience this way? Honestly, inconsistency is one of the hardest things I find to be patient with, which is ironic considering I run a YouTube channel which only ever goes through the filter of myself, but if the content has to be fleeting, why not do your damnedest to make sure that it's all good? I'd say if an expansion is terribly bulky, and Shattered Space certainly isn't long nor short, in the end of the day it is an expansion to a Bethesda RPG, that depends on how you play it. I think in order to compensate it needs to be ensured that every moment spent feels worthwhile. And sadly in gaming nothing is a greater waste of the player's time than fetch quests, or indeed a series of them. Even with their own unique twangs, you're still running around collecting things, or inversely delivering them, which isn't inspiring gameplay that differs greatly from wandering the map aimlessly and shooting everything in sight, as finding yourself in random combat situations is quite common, I would say. Now, to the side quests' credit, they do have moments where they are enhancing the lore, helping us understand House Varun and its culture, and let's face it, you'd hope so. But what good is that when the delivery isn't engaging you? Not that there aren't, of course, exceptions. For instance, aiding that forgetful old fellow I mentioned before, and preparing two brothers to duel each other to the death by spiking their drinks so they fall asleep instead. And they certainly offer some redemption in a way for the more cookie-cutter quests there are. But as I'm about to continue to explain, for a DLC that costs money beyond buying simply the base game, something's just lacking about Shattered Space. Exploration outside of doing side quests isn't what I'd call hugely rewarding. I mean, sure, there's an alien world to soak in, and that might be enough, say if this was The Elder Scrolls 3 Morrowind, or the Dragonborn DLC for Skyrim, because in both those titles the peculiar flora, fauna and overall environment is actually contrasting something we can relate with. In Starfield, an alien world, however, is a given. So as far as moving through the world is concerned, it doesn't stand out majorly, and it doesn't possess enough novelty to serve as a hook. The silvery blue skies, purple fog, strange rock formations, and pockets of zero gravity don't stand out all that much when there are hundreds of other worlds you can visit. When you can visit 1,000 planets already, what is the actual value in allowing us to visit the 1,001st? And at that point, can its alien qualities truly demand the same captivation as the Elder Scrolls 3 Morrowind? If you ask me, it takes much more to accomplish that, much less render the exploration rewarding, than to simply provide more detail than your average procedurally generated world. I commend the efforts that are made, but Starfield itself is undermining it, and so the gratification of doing in this world space isn't as potent. As for more physical rewards, we get a new player home for completing the main quest, and importantly there are of course new companions to adventure with. For instance, good old Tane here. He may occupy the quintessential smuggler archetype, and he may look like an avid Millwall fan, but it's the thought that counts and he has his own tale to tell. As for other tangibles, there are no new ships and parts, but considering the entire point of the DLC is to stay fixed on one planet, I'd say that's not something reasonable to mark Shattered Space down for. After all, why would Shattered Space give you a new ship or indeed new parts to play around with, and then consciously not provide you with the opportunity to use it? But let's face it, the spaceship customization, if not the spaceflight itself, is a huge layer of flavour for Starfield, and it being as good as absent past the introductory quest at least is noticeable. But that's really more an issue of them not replacing that system with anything, if it's even an issue at all, and I can respect that the ships are just not a part of the DLC's scope. Whether or not it should be in some capacity, considering the ambition of the game itself, is definitely worth debating, but not here. There are new outfits and weapons to find, and since I hadn't played Starfield for a while, I'm simply going to have to take the internet's word for this, that apparently there are a lot of reskins of things. Now, I don't know if that's true, but anecdotally speaking, none of the loot that I found on bodies of enemies that I killed really popped to me. I did notice some new weapon additions with new effects, but they sort of blend into the mush, which is alright. They may not contribute much to the DLC's depth either way, and it's not something I pay a lot of attention to. Provided there are effective weapons for my character's level, I'm a happy man. Now, I'd like to bring everything together before I get too carried away and the video winds up being 16 weeks in length, but I do have a couple more points to burn through, for instance the enemy variety. Shattered Space does provide a couple new enemy archetypes, for instance the Redeemed, that are basically berserkers of the House Varun. They're quite scary to be honest, but yeah, they're cool. On the other hand, teleporting translucent people feel cheap if not painful to deal with at times, but they are rather comprehensively linked with the main story's mystery, so they get a pass for that. But if you ask me, the Vortex horrors need to go away and behave themselves. Varun Zealots carry over from the base game, they exist here too, and that's a nice way to bridge the gap I suppose, but by the time you come to tackle the DLC, aside from the Redeemed in their ranks, you'll probably come to know what to expect. But I suppose the point I'm trying to make is there is some, if not much, variety to the encounters found in Shattered Space versus those found in the base game, with the odd new enemy type appearing. And in failing making a point worthy of your ears, I simply wanted to touch down on that fact. And the other thing I'd like to talk about a bit is the DLC story. It does have some stiff dialogue and is rather rough around the edges, and Bethesda can't seem to help themselves when it comes to Chosen One tropes, which I find to be annoying at the best of times. But its premise is interesting. We're attempting to solve the mystery of why people are translucent and can teleport and are aggressive, while allowing us to soak up lore about House Varun and its culture. However, a huge chunk of the plot is wasted on uniting the houses, and the best that could be is a series of unrelated quests to bring the influential families of House Varun on side. There is plentiful room for decision making within these quests, allowing us to be good or go down a more evil path if we so wish to, but I'm not too convinced that would have much bearing. Not that I would know outside what I've read, considering I've only indulged one playthrough of Shattered Space, but the issue that actually arises is the DLC's main story's runtime dedicates a lot of time to solving unrelated problems to the main one, and a lot of stories are like that, especially in role-playing games. For instance, The Witcher 3 can be a right wild goose chase, but when you find yourself supplementing the story with these less than immediately relevant subplots, I think Shattered Space would have benefited from a wider variety of tones, themes and very fundamental obstacles to ensure that one quest doesn't roll into the next. Not to the point where it feels disjointed, but you can distinctly recognise what avenue you're currently exploring. Shattered Space as it stands doesn't do a right lot to transcend simply darting about and doing things. Not that there aren't moments where more conscious actions are injected, and a big example of that I would argue is the DLC's ending. Not that I can comment on the impact of it, having only played through Shattered Space once. But I do think the much for muchness middle section that is aligning the houses is probably not given the greatest opportunity to expand outwards in different directions because of the environment. And I know that sounds crazy if I'm not treading over an aforementioned point, but the easiest way to establish variety is with visuals. And since Starfield on the whole is targeted at the galactic scale, environments seldom roll into each other at the planet level. There are a variety of environments, but they exist on different worlds, and sadly, Varun Kai is no different. It's one city and the surrounding areas and all houses exist within it. There's no venturing to other settlements and ingratiating ourselves with communities as and when we get to them. It's all occurring at the same time. All three of the major houses are occupying the same city and seem to be getting along just fine. What is there to align in the first place? They don't really have space to breathe independently where we can recognise the differences between one subculture and the next that would not only cement the influence of these noble houses, but would also take us farther afield to places distinctly different from the places we've been before, allowing us to soak in not just more of this faction's culture, but the overall world's diversity in an environment where the task of aligning these houses feels more than just being an errand boy, who also happens to kill people. Granted, if you blended Shattered Space into experiencing the base game as one cohesive thing, I don't think the lack of diversification on one world would really occur to you as much of a problem. However, in the isolated context of the DLC, it really is. The sense of culture that Bethesda is attempting to sell here is stunted by the fact that none of it really gets room to breathe. And by that I mean there's not enough done with these houses that occupies a good half of the DLC's main plot that makes them unique. There's no attempt to demonstrate their individual influences, they don't dress nor behave very differently, and they all occupy the same city. In fact, they're virtually most of Dazra's inhabitants. What influence do they even have? The end result is it just feels like you're running errands for the sake of it. In fact, it would be no worse if every house simply sent you to Big Tesco for a Twix, because you'll see about as much that way except your life will be easier. And we can talk about the plot that justifies it as much as possible, but the premise of Shattered Space is to show us House Varun in their natural habitat, so to speak. As in the rest of the game, House Varun has a real sense of mystery about them, and it would have been far more interesting to see that be explored with layers. It's my belief that this is a casualty of Starfield's interstellar scaling. Because the open world itself is divided up into hundreds of individual planets, the world spaces no longer roll into each other at all. There may be some slight variation in biome if you take off and land on the pole of a planet, but because the game is designed to not just be about one world, an expansion that focuses on just the one still has to adhere to that philosophy to some degree. Sadly, the end result is the world and story depth becomes limited, because you can soak in the bulk of what this world has to offer on one very fleeting visit. What I'm trying to say is, beyond what's superficial, the story has no culture to elaborate. There's the idea of what House Varun is going into the expansion, and sadly that's all it feels like coming out. That doesn't mean the story isn't serviceable, but it's certainly rendered far less interesting than it had the potential to be. So to bring this video to its conclusion, if you liked Starfield, I don't see a reason why you'd necessarily actively dislike Shattered Space, as it's just more Starfield. It doesn't do a right awful lot to address a lot of the criticisms found with the base game, and though it attempts to be more focused on one world as opposed to having you jump about the place, and may indeed not rely as much on procedural generation so quickly, it's still very much so a Starfield caliber world, and for what is not a cheap expansion, it simply blends far too quickly into feeling like the base game. I wouldn't say it's a terrible expansion, as there is a degree to which it can be enjoyed, but it's very superficial and honestly a tad underwhelming. Off the back of it, am I necessarily worried about the Elder Scrolls 6? No, firstly because I'll be dead long before the Elder Scrolls 6 drops probably, and secondly because I feel Shattered Space's issues largely stem from the fact that it's Starfield, and though there are attempts to medicate them in this DLC, Starfield's issues are still rampant. It's a game that in concept sounded breathtaking, and it certainly had moments where it lived up to that, but shortcuts had to be taken to make it possible to begin with, and it's those shortcuts that harm it. I wouldn't say Shattered Space is necessarily instantly plagued by the same issue. It's simply breaking from that mould by isolating us to this one planet for a few hours, and then being far too careful to avoid standing out versus the rest of the game that truly prevents it from thriving, and as a result it feels more like cut content than a DLC. And with that, I bring today's video to its end. It's probably the first time in 2024 that I've actually spoken about something new-ish, and I do understand that it's not the most positive video I've ever made, but honestly I came away with opinions and wanted to give them. Am I an authority on these matters? No. Let me know your thoughts in the comments section. But look, if you've managed to suffer through my yapping for this long, I do appreciate it, and want to thank you for watching this video. I really hope that you enjoyed it, and if you did, I'd appreciate it if you went ahead and hit the like button, maybe even subscribe. It's completely up to you. There's no pressure on that, like really, I mean that. As nice as it would be, I'm not really trying to cultivate a supermassive black hole of a YouTube channel for the sake of it. These days I just kind of show up, post my shit and then leave. Regardless, hopefully with any luck I'll be seeing you all very soon with another video at some point. But until next time, please, take care and goodbye.